All right, let's do this. Hi, everyone. We're doing this session to talk about being nimble and tech forward in clinical trial operations. Many people in the audience would have had some or a lot of experience in clinical trial operations, but at the same time, we want to bring quite a bit of traditional tech perspective into what that means in clinical trials. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Um, let's start with just intros to the team that we have today here. Um, we have Emil Kolek, who's a senior software engineer at Lindus Health. And that's where I am also part of the team as head of product management. At the same time, we have Dan Goods from Signos, who's the chief of staff over there. Um, Maybe quick introductions in the companies as well. So Lindus Health, our company runs end-to-end clinical trials, and our mission is to accelerate clinical trials for health tech and biotech pioneers. And we're really excited about making the whole process much more efficient than it currently is. Briefly, Dan, to you to introduce Signos.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the opportunity. So Signos is a Series B startup. We're backed by companies like Google, Samsung, and Dexcom. And our mission is to combat the obesity epidemic here in the US and globally. We do that through a metabolic health solution that uses a continuous glucose monitor, which was originally developed for diabetics. We use this for non-diabetics, paired with an AI-powered app to provide people with personalized diet, exercise, and lifestyle so that they can live their best life and live a healthier life and a metabolically healthy life without having to take expensive medication that may have a lot of side effects or have a one-size-fits-all diet. It's all centered around what's best for them in a personalized journey, leveraging a CGM and our app on top of that.
It's awesome. Yeah, definitely one of really exciting companies in that space. Yeah, Emil, also just giving you a bit of opportunity to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Amiel, software engineer at Lindus Health. My experience prior to Lindus Health was sort of nothing health tech related, rather just focused on e-commerce and stuff like that. So I have learned a lot joining Lindus Health with clinical trial space and enjoy sort of applying the learnings from working in big tech to clinical trials.
Nice. Great. So let's kick into and talk a bit about our agenda today. We have had intros, just finished that. There's really three things we want to talk about today. First one, starting a bit strongly is and setting the theme for today. It's operating in a tech forward way when running clinical trials, and we're really keen to really dig down and talk about what that means. Then we'll follow that with briefly talking about the challenges of doing that, and then follow that with, well, let's talk about what are the actual specific benefits of doing this, of operating in that tech forward way. So with that in mind, let's kick into the first topic. So we wanted this to be a conversation. So we start with asking a few leading questions, and then hopefully we got an interesting conversation going. So operating in a tech forward way of running trials. We have to start by just asking, what does it mean to operate in a more nimble and tech forward way like trials? Just repeating that once more. I wanted to start with an introduction of how we see it. The highest level perspective on this is that clinical trials are an incredibly complex process. It's highly regulated, and there are very serious barriers to not only entry as a company who would want to run clinical trials or help other companies run clinical trials, but also huge barriers to entry for companies like Signos or other companies to really think through and navigate the complex landscape of knowing what that looks like. But the reason we think it's very important to bring this perspective is because of that fact. It's very complicated. So what makes being nimble quite challenging. And that sort of sets the theme for today. I want to kick this off by just sort of handing over to Emil, to you to start us off with giving your background in like large tech companies. What's your experience with operating in tech forward way, and where does the connection to running clinical trials comes for you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think to me, operating in sort of a nimble and tech forward way, I think it means a couple of things. The first thing is just around challenging assumptions. When you approach a new problem, just because something's done the way it's done now doesn't mean that's the right way to do it. And I think that's especially true for something like clinical trials, where it is very complex and it is very challenging. And there's a lot of incumbents who do things in a non-ideal way. And it's really easy to assume that there's a reason it's done that way. It's because it's difficult, when in reality, that's not necessarily the case. It could just be, an inefficient setup. So I think a big part of it is actually sort of taking things back to first principles, asking what problem are we actually trying to solve, and sort of approaching it with fresh eyes, rather than trusting that the way that things are currently done is actually necessary. I think the second part, which maybe is a little bit more towards the nimble side, is just around being biased for action. Something I learned, I used to work at Facebook, where the slogan move fast. And something that I learned there is that when you're approached with a problem, it's really good to sort of think, okay, how can I actually get started on this today? And how can I quickly make progress? Rather than approaching it from a space of, oh, what are all the challenges that I'm going to face? Okay, let's take some time. Let's schedule something later. Let's think about it. Really sort of biasing towards action and trying to make progress is a really helpful mindset. And I think that's a big part of sort of being tech forward and being nimble. And it's especially useful in clinical trials.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, I think Facebook said move fast and break things, which we,
yes,
in one of our blog posts do, move fast, don't break things, which I think actually it's quite a fitting perspective here.
Yeah, they got rid of the break things later on, because they realized it sounds like you're endorsing breaking things, which is not the goal.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to break things here. And that's very interesting, because actually there's an argument for a lot of things breaking when you're don't have that bias to action. It's an interesting perspective worth diving into later. Dan, you have background in life sciences, and you understand clinical trials. What does this message mean to you? What does operating tech forward and nimble mean to you in running a clinical trial?
I think in general, and I think probably how Lindus is structured, the connection between more of probably your account managers or project managers, or a lot of folks that typically will operate different trials, is very close with the product and engineering team at Lindus. So when there are changes that need to happen, the cycles are quick. And I think that's compounded with the fact that Lindus has a singular platform versus needing to cobble together lots of platforms. So the connection to be able to make changes quickly is there in terms of how the team is structured, and then the ability to actually make those changes quickly because of how the technology is structured actually allows for that. So I think there's probably, I think it's a very nice thing to say, and Lindus can say it and anyone can say it. I think, being structured that way and having the technology to do it is probably the hardest thing. And so being able, you kind of can back it up in that way. So, we have a super large or very large observational study with, tens of thousands of people in it. And, a lot of things will change or need to get updated over time. And I think in any trial, things will come up. And so being able to actually adapt to those and having those flow through to the different systems and protocols and forms that need to happen, the teams can make the change, and then the the platform can adapt to it. So I think it's both an ethos as well as, you know, structural things that are in general, and I think also how Lindus is structured.
No, I think you make a really good deep dive into that Nimble aspect of it. One of those things that we are very well aware of is like things are always happening when you're working with humans, especially whether it's an observation study or not. There's a lot of unknown unknowns. So it's very much we think about, right, what features you might think about. No, we need X and Y features. If you don't account for all the other things, like how those features will interact, it actually really blocks you from being nimble. And I think that's, I guess, one of the points we want to kick this off, right? So why that's important.
I think the second bullet, I guess, is probably a question for you all, is like how do you measure the nimbleness, right? So what outcomes, or how do you measure it? I think that's probably, I don't know if you guys have that internally, but, you know, in what way would you say we are being quote unquote nimble, or, you know, this month we were more nimble than last month, or whatever it might be?
Yeah, that's a great question, because so I think what we've learned the most is having, you know, you can have, like I said, everyone says they have a platform, everyone says they have teams. What we find the most interesting is when things change, there needs to be shared context. Getting access to shared context is not easy. Amongst two people who are exchanging an email, you already have, you know, need to send the right message to the right person. When you're operating with a study team of 15 people, a change at a study level is going to impact a lot of stakeholders. So one way to answer that, what we think is coming really practically into really sort of has high impact, is software engineers, i.e. the people who have built the thing the study team is using, are not, you know, buildings away, or not even an email away. They're actually like a Slack message away from a person who might give them an extra context. I've always thought about how that's like such a simple thing, but then I think about generally organizational communication is a problem. We know this. Then I take that forward and I say, in a clinical trial, the need for accuracy is even higher. And then I finally think about, well, why do we hear so much about slow clinical operations? Well, we have had cases where we had to work with a vendor who was doing a super simple change. You know, they had to create one form to make something work. It took me at least 7 days to get a response from them for my request for change. And then we scheduled a meeting to schedule another meeting where they would be announcing the change. So there's so much work that goes into gaining that context of what needs to happen. So to us, the nimbleness, and I'll get to measuring in a second, the nimbleness comes in, are we creating access of people to get the information they need? That's where our tech, like nimbleness, comes in. The tech-driven bit is also interesting, because then you start thinking about, oh, how are you measuring this? Well, I can talk about the boring things like having a support desk that works all the time, you know, and people are looking at it, and then we have a assigned person who's like responding to them. But to me, honestly, it's so much more. When a support request comes in and it's from a study that an engineer has not participated in building or preparing, and a question comes in saying someone's observational period survey is going to be late, we need to do something, getting them the right information to make that change is very difficult. So we do that by leaning onto the culture. I think that's my best answer. Avoiding roadblocks, avoiding people getting a feeling that I can't ask this question. Measuring is a good point. I think we do a lot of measuring on like support requests, like, you know, 24 hours to first request. If it goes to 7 days, you know, it gets flagged. But I think you make a good point. There's definitely more that can be done there so that people are actually able to move fast. Emil, really want to hand it over to you from the perspective of someone that has to make these changes.
Yeah, it's a super interesting point with regard to measuring. I think a lot of it comes down to not us necessarily measuring our nimbleness, but rather goaling on how tech forward we're being. And I think those are quite closely connected, because the more that we can automate and the more that we can remove humans from processes, the faster we can move. And also the less errors there will be, because there's not a human in between, copying something over. So I suppose part of the way that we assess how nimble we are is by, how effectively are we automating processes. And by automating processes, I mean things like, for example, we're collecting data, we've collected some abnormal data, we're going to apply some machine learning to say, hey, this is abnormal, and notify someone that something's abnormal. So we no longer need to have people sort of crawling through data to find a problem. We instantly know something was wrong. But also automating processes like, actually building a study, so that once the study's been designed and built, it's one click, it's ready to go. There's no longer sending a PDF over to a vendor who's going to print it out and hand it to the people at a site. That's another example of sort of automating that allows us to be nimble. So I think we're in an indirect sense, we kind of measure how nimble we are by looking at all the processes we have and how effectively we're automating them. And actually going back to this example of, maybe a survey needs to be sent out again, and that's a support request ticket. Well, if we're getting a lot of support request tickets about surveys needing to be sent out again, then we just say, hey, let's just build a button that lets clinical trial staff send out that survey. And that's actually what happened. We were getting so many requests, and the engineers were dealing with them. So the engineers just said, we're just going to add a button. And that took them a couple hours, and now we don't get those requests anymore, because they can, the trial staff can do it themselves.
Yeah, I think one interesting point here is in some ways the balance of different domains. So for instance, like when changes are made, I found there actually are quite a bit of sign-offs and checks, and so there's a balance of, yes, you may be automating a lot of things on the front end, or getting them to the point where it's ready to be completed, let's say. So just to make up an example, a change order, you may cut out a bunch of days of processing time to get that change order to be ready, but there still is the thorough balance of checks that you have at the end to make sure that there are the sign-offs. And so, things don't slip through. So, quality remains high, right? And so there's probably some quality and nimbleness, that to the back to the point of not breaking things, right? Of, if you have some matrix of quality and nimbleness, you kind of want to be at the top right of both of those. And so the checks are the thing that kind of are the breaks at the very end to make sure nothing, quote unquote, slips through as well. And so I think that's an important, you have to keep that as part of the process. You can't just go at light speed all the time. That's an important thing to balance, to make sure you're nimble throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's also sort of ties in nicely with this idea of approaching things from first principles and asking ourselves, like, from a first principles perspective, what are the things that we need to ensure quality, and what is just sort of theater that everybody else does? And by reducing the list of things that we need to the things that actually genuinely improve quality and generally prevent mistakes, we can continue to move nimbly while not actually sort of increasing the risk, but still removing process that's just unnecessary.
Yeah, I want to add my personal feelings that I get. So there's yeah, like I said, there are things you can automate. One of the most gut-wrenching things to look at in running a trial is I look at a process, and it seems so far that you could automate this. Right? Someone needs to put a signature on something, someone needs time to review something. Those are very interesting challenges. There's more on that, I think, later. So, but I think the key point here is I'm sort of concluding this slide with saying that sort of nimbleness can come at a cost. So what are you doing about it? I want to move on to our second section, which is actually a deeper dive into the challenges. We might have covered quite a bit of this, but I think I wanted to hand over to Emil here to dive a bit more into that. Off to you.
Yeah, I think we kind of started chatting about this a little bit already, but we've sort of developed a sense of what we mean when we're saying moving nimbly and being tech forward. So I guess just to sort of kick off this discussion, Nijat, maybe I'll ask you, what do you think some of like the key challenges are to overcome when trying to operate nimbly and sort of tech forward in a clinical trial space?
Yeah, I think everything for us starts at the realization that data points in a spreadsheet in our space are not just data points, they are something collected from humans, from patients who are participating in this thing that we are creating, not out of for either health reasons or actually quite a meaningful purpose, right? To drive for research forward. So what that means is, to me, as opposed to, I'm going to make a generalization, right? As opposed to many other technology systems and actually technology like industries from which this tech nimbleness came from, like consumer products, like e-commerce, like communications. We just have a much higher duty responsibility to the people that are using these systems or people that are impacted by these systems. So that comes at the very top for us. So connecting that to, what is the cost of us being fast? Things should not get missed. Regulation is the no comment barrier. You might want to do a feature, and then right now I have a document with like 5 people who are checking every single reg that might be impacted by a feature, and we're sense checking it over and over. So that creates a barrier to, like, let's say, let's do it fast, or let's not do this thing because we want to do something else fast because we're really excited about this automation feature. I want to plant the seed for the third thing, not too long on this, is there's actually very, very poor systemic incentives to be fast in this space. It's a very complicated topic because on the one hand, you look at the industry, you go back 100 years and you track it down of like timeline of events that led to the current environment we're in. You have no choice but to say there are good reasons for these barriers, for these roadblocks, for these checks and balances to exist. So that creates a barrier, that creates a challenge that makes it a more interesting problem to solve. Because I think one trap we can fall into is to be a bit too tech optimistic and say, well, everything they've done so far doesn't make sense. We have to break it. Can't do that. So there needs to be like respect for the status quo and real like dedicated effort to understand what the regs are saying. So that to me is like the main challenges there.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
One thing I'd add to all that, I think all that's right, is there are a ton of different stakeholders, and often many of them have similar but not all the same incentives or needs. And so all of them need to be accounted for, rightfully so. So it's not a like, oh shoot, we have a bunch of stakeholders, let's try to remove them. Like, you're not going to change that. There are going to be a bunch of stakeholders. That's how the system is and will remain. And so I think the challenge is, there's probably that will limit some of the, nimbleness you can have, some of the speed you can have, rightfully so. But it's working within that system and in some ways trying to be thoughtful about the needs of all those stakeholders and solving for them independently. But I think when it comes to sign-offs, when it comes to, all of these people need to be accounted for versus just, you're an e-commerce site and there's one stakeholder you have to think about is, the buyer, and therefore you just run towards everything that they need. Obviously, it's a different system, but because they're all the stakeholders, you have to account for all of them.
I mean, I'd like to dig just a little bit deeper there because I think you Dan, you introduced an interesting next step there. Sponsors, right? When I mentioned the poor incentives bit, what I was partially saying is because of those poor incentives, we mentioned patient safety is an important bit, but we think sponsors very often get the short end of that stick. For me to get the news or the update to the sponsor, I have to talk to like these other stakeholders. So maybe just at risk of getting you to repeat sort of your perspectives. So from a sponsor's perspective, what's your experience been of like of seeing those challenges and challenges of being too slow, or challenges with needing to be slower because you have to? Like what frustrations have you had there?
Excuse me. Yeah. I mean, every sponsor's needs are going to be different. Every study's going to be different. You know, we have these large observational studies, so you know, our needs in them are certainly different than, I don't know, if someone's running an FDA trial or something else. And so I can't speak. I think sponsors are not a monolithic cohort of individuals. I think I certainly can speak probably in generalized for companies more in the digital health space. You know, anything that a digital health company is going to need, especially a smaller digital health company, is going to be very different than what Merck is going to need or somebody else in terms of what they're going to need in a trial. And I think when it comes to sponsors challenges in a digital health sponsor, particularly, you know, you're going to want to move quickly. You're going to want to have visibility into your pacing and your speed. I think there's also probably reality. You're probably pretty bad at this in terms of the sponsor because you've never done it before or you've done it in a limited time. So I think a challenge a lot of digital health companies in particular have in running trials is they don't know exactly what they're doing, right? Because they haven't done it. They might have 0 people on their team that have run trials. They might have a couple people. They've never run a trial like this before. And so I think part of it is being a partner with them. Some of this is how you set up the contracts. Because I think when you don't know exactly what you're doing, and that's not because you have bad intent, that's because you're new at this. Like if the contract isn't set up right, there's kind of like a drip, where every new thing, every change is this just kind of like, it creates tension in the relationship. It slows things down because it's like everything's a change order to the contract and all this kind of stuff. And so I think part of that is planning for that, knowing that there might be changes along the way, both from a like services standpoint as well from a build and technology standpoint. So I mean, there are a million challenges that are unique to every sponsor, every trial. I would say for digital health companies in general, they're not going to have a lot of experience. And so anticipate that. And I think from a CRO perspective, you can either take advantage of that or help them along the way. You know, I think Lindus does a good job of helping along the way and being a partner in that and kind of like recognizing that versus the drip of like, well, that's something new. And that's where things really slow down, or it just becomes a tenuous relationship and kind of sucks for everybody.
Yeah, I felt that. That was quite meaningful to hear. Connects to the incentives bit. Yeah.
I think also just on the sort of topic of change orders and sort of dripping through, I guess one thing that we wanted to call out specifically was fragmentation and how the fragmentation of systems that are involved in running a clinical trial can sort of make these types of things more painful. So I don't know if you can, Dan, if you can share any sort of examples or experiences when it comes to dealing with these types of change orders or any sort of anything really, and how fragmentation can make that more challenging.
And when you say fragmentation, do you mean like system fragmentation or team fragmentation?
I think it's a bit of both, sort of system fragmentation, and then also how, you know, a lot of CROs will subcontract large parts of a trial. So you're working across, you know, vendors, and then each vendor is on their own different system.
Yeah. So I mean, I think again, every trial, every or study, and every sponsor is gonna be different. But I think in general, when a lot of things are subcontracted out, whether those are systems or services, when things have to change, there's just a cascading effect. And that means the party that is changing may or may not be willing. That party that is changing may or not be available. The party that is changing may or may not ask for things or be fast or be slow. And so you kind of like things just bubble out from the center where there's a smaller group of folks trying to execute and move quicker. And so it just like compound, it's not just speed, there's a quality element of that, right? Because there's a game of telephone that happens when it's like me to you and you to somebody else and you to somebody else. Excuse me. And so I think it's both speed and quality that when you have fragmentation both of people and teams as well as systems. And so example, if you're, I don't know, surveys that someone needs to take as part of a trial. I don't know if people are taking some type of survey, are in a completely different platform, and then you have to change those. Like 7 more people have to be involved, and they may or may not be able to do it this week or next week or the week after. And it's just more unknowns versus if it's all under one roof. So in some ways, I mean, it's like it's more knowns versus unknowns, or more variables that you introduce, the more people or systems that have to come in place. So I think I can't speak for how bad the fragmentation or every problem that it leads to, but I think it's pretty clear, like more fragmentation is probably going to lead to poorer quality and less nimbleness, less speed when changes need to be made. And I think particularly for digital health companies where they're running their first or some of their first trials, like changes are going to happen. So if you don't think changes are going to happen, best of luck. Maybe you're right, but most likely probably they will. And it's how do you adapt to them when they do?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think for just from an engineer's perspective as well, something that I've learned sort of working on Lindus Health, where we have this sort of unified platform, is that working on a platform that's going to be touching all aspects of a trial forces you to think about all different types of cases and what can happen in a trial. If one piece of a trial is a black box, it's really easy for you to ignore, what could go wrong in this corner, or if this part changes, what implications does it have for the rest of the trial? You can sort of say, oh, well, that's part of that black box. That's not really my problem. And I think working on a system that is intended to do everything from study design all the way to analysis and submission ready export, you really have to think through, if this variable changes here, what is that going to mean down the road? And it really forces you to approach the problem differently, as opposed to if it wasn't really under your remit. Then I can definitely see how as an engineer working on a system that was dedicated exclusively to one small piece, I wouldn't be as concerned with how a change up the line is going to affect something down. It just doesn't really come to mind as I'm working.
When I invoke, I have so many examples of this. At a study plan, all the timelines are fitting. We have an expectation with one of our vendors that they're going to do this thing. It's going to take, they've always done it for 3 weeks. Everything's planned for that. And then suddenly they have a backlog and, the study's late by 6 weeks. And we just have no control over that. So, we're moving away from those type of things. Second thing is, the hardest thing for me to have to accept is this unintended consequence of people saying it's not my problem anymore. Someone else looking at it. That's really, I can see why that's happening, but that's not a good feeling to deal with when we know we have to be responsible for the whole thing, because the sponsor is responsible for the whole thing. That's to me where the sponsor gets the short end of the stick. Should we move on to the final section of this, which was meant to be about the benefits of not doing the things that we talked about that create challenges? So just to try to sum up what we'll be talking about, we want to operate nimbly, want to be tech forward, and we want to be across the whole trial life cycle. And how, given the fragmentation challenges, that can have significant benefits. Kicking this off, so, well, how might what we're calling unified tech platform help planning a trial. Now, the format of this is a little interesting. So we're starting off with like, what is it like in planning and what is it like in execution? Because I actually think I want to dive into a bit about what people sort of underestimate is how much error can you prevent from happening? How much risk to changes can you minimize when you're planning a trial? Just kicking this off, so Dan, what's your experience on what it means to like I know you mentioned digital health companies actually often run like first, second trials, in their life cycle. What's the perspective there on what it means to plan a trial versus execute a trial, and how much you actually put weight on one or the other? Because we have a sense that there isn't that much going into planning, and it's more of a rote process, ticking check boxes versus a bit of a more of an involved process.
You're saying what does it involve? What does the planning look like for a digital health company to go into a trial?
I guess just to trying to keep this. So I'm just wondering, since we talked about having like no fragmentation and unified
Sure.
tech platform, what resonates about that with you when it comes to planning a trial?
Well, to be honest, I probably didn't fully appreciate it until kind of seeing it up close and personal. So that is probably some reality. Like you kind of don't know the advantages until you feel it or you see it. But I think like it in some ways it matches the ethos of the company you work at with the company you're working with. So kind of the like, I'll get back to you in a couple of days response isn't super satisfying as like a earlier stage startup, because that's not really the mentality you have internally as well. So I think it matches the ethos. I think the fact that on the other side is a product that is that's nimble, that is malleable to your needs, again, matches kind of your expectation as well. I think just kind of being told, here's Salesforce, go deal with it, an equivalent of that isn't particularly helpful, or the need probably in this instance. So again, I think it matches the speed and or nimbleness and the quality, and if there's kind of a 2x2 matrix around that, where we want high quality, but I think the fact that it's a singular platform in many ways better enables that. And so it's kind of this weird thing where you get more speed but more quality because you have fewer hands in the pot. You have fewer, let me go talk to this other person or this other company in the game of telephone. I don't know if I have necessarily data to prove that, but it's certainly anecdotally, I would say it feels like there's just like less variables involved. There are less people, there are less hoops to jump through. It's less painful. It's less friction. It's less, who's that other person on the other side, right? There's a single person to go through. There's a single platform. And so all that just streamlines the process. And I do think leads to probably higher nimbleness and higher quality.
I want to add some data to this one. So, because there have been two cases that have been quite inspiring for us. One of our customers had planned the study and had, as part of their planning, procured one of those like out of the box systems. 9 months later, they came to us saying, I don't know how to use this. Because it does the thing that I want to do, collect the data. I don't know how to use it, because it's a great product, right? But if people who build it find a common denominator that fits the wider market. And someone picks it up like, it's like, I don't know how to use it. A second one with another customer, we had a situation where the study was being planned and there was a certain set of processes set. The site was going to do X and Y and Z on paper and then do double entry, which is kind of standard practice in studies. My read of that, so what happened was we managed to come in and say, we understand that like X and Y have to be done on paper because of your SOPs, because of your processes, and because it's a new platform. but Z could be done on this platform. Let us show you how that might be possible. That was a very interesting case study, because then if there was someone, going back to your Salesforce example, right? If I'm just buying it off the shelf, then I need to go pay for support, right? For people who are hired to get through as many support requests as they can to get people to use it. But that just does not solve the problem here. You have it unified, but the connection of the different pieces in the unification actually plays a very important role. That's where I think I've seen where you kind of can bring the value in unifying these things, because people who built it would have thought about the X and the Y's and the Z's, not just about the X, which is what you would procure a vendor for.
There are also, I think there are a lot of fancy terms and acronyms thrown out in clinical research that kind of a lot of times obscure what it is actually happening, and or what actually is just a thing where you can get signatures, or a thing where you can get sign-offs, or a thing that randomizes people, or a thing that sends out surveys, or whatever it might be. And so it kind of, especially I think for digital health companies that have not run a lot of trials, it makes it seem less approachable, or less that you are in control, or even just what the heck that thing is. And so I think that's a challenge. The benefit of singular platform is like it's just all there. I do think, one thing that is a reality is there are way more systems and processes and just aspects of any type of trial or study, regardless of what you're running, than you probably expected. Like, I think that's probably a good estimation for any sponsor. And our observational studies aren't, I think, on the grand order of things, particularly complex, but yet there's still more to them than we expected as a digital health company. And so from that standpoint, I think having a partner that can educate you on that. Also, if you don't have a centralized platform, it just wears you down, because there are so many vendors and there's so much process that has to go into just managing them. So just the management overhead of all the vendors and any changes that have to happen with them and billing and everything, I think becomes cumbersome as well.
Yeah, I mean, we feel it, right? I mean, I appreciate you said, first of all, when you were talking about the acronyms, I think both Emil and I were kind of smiling, because that stings.
That really, really resonates, especially
Yeah.
as like an engineer, like coming from a non-clinical trial space to this space and being like, oh, we need to build all this stuff, and then like starting to understand a little more about what each thing is, and realizing, yeah, that resonates.
Sorry, but when you give something electronic data capture, not only does not explain what needs to happen in the study, that also confuses things more. Which parts, what type of, what am I doing here? Yeah, that's an interesting one. There is another part to this, right? So maybe playing devil's advocate, right? We talk about unification a lot, and you might argue that technology in this space has taken a bit of organic evolution path, right? So people were doing biostats. So because the process is fragmented at the services level, right? The sponsor will find one CRO, for the sake of argument, to do biostats, and one CRO to do the data capture. People who would be building, like and these two CROs create a market for technology. But the market they create is biostats technology market and data capture technology market, which then leads to, you say, well, why wouldn't these tech products be quite narrow in their scope? Next question is, why are they not integrated? Well, integration is extremely hard. Data consistency, and we're getting a bit of technicals, but it really matters here, right? The wanted to go into the benefits of, like, if you can unlock the connections to work, what can you get? Emil, we really want to hear your perspective on that bit.
Yeah, I think it also ties into, Dan, what you were saying earlier about quality, because I think there's a couple of different aspects to quality. One of them is the sort of quality of service and with regard to responsiveness and motivation to solve problems. There's also a quality of outcomes and the quality of the data actually collected to answer the research question. So one key advantage to a unified tech platform is that we can use a digital data flow to sort of understand exactly what data will actually be collected and when as the study is run before the study is started. So we can plan a study, we can configure a study, we can use that system to say, okay, here we're going to collect, these lab results that are going to be in this format, this STTM submission ready format. And from that, we can actually conduct a example analysis in advance of even starting the study because we know conclusively what data we're going to collect. Whereas if it were across multiple vendors, we could never really know what data we're going to get sent back. And that means that actually before even starting a study, we can do a statistical power calculation. We can say, actually, with this data, to reach statistical significance, we need more participants. And if we didn't have the advantage of doing that in advance, there's a likelihood we could have started a trial and gotten to the end and realized, wait a minute, we don't actually have statistical significance, as one sort of smaller example. But by having everything in one place and knowing in advance all the data we're going to collect, we can ensure quality of data outcomes as well as the quality of service. And I think that's, to me at least, from a technical perspective, like the most exciting thing about a unified platform is that it's not really possible to do this simply now because of how sort of fragmented all the different tech systems are.
Yeah, I wanted to connect this back to the fragmentation and sponsors. So one of these challenges that we like is a very high signal challenge, but we don't see a lot of people talking about it, which is after you finish the trial, how do you reconcile all your data? It might be a simple study. If you're doing an observational study in wearables, maybe all of it is coming from one device. By the way, that's still coming from 10,000 devices. That itself is a problem. If you're collecting 10 different types of data, what language are you using to create a story? So what we saw was that the FDA and all of these large pharma companies were kind of spent the last 15 years in their corner trying to solve this problem of we can't make sense of the data we're getting. And they created a bunch of these standards. But what was interesting is when they took that knowledge back to the industry, and FDA in 2018, I believe, made it mandatory that there should be a certain scheme of the data. The industry really did not know how to react because those CROs at the fragmented level were designing CRFs based on their current practices, based on their experiences, and everyone was doing things in a different way. So to bring this back to actually the second point, why does having this unification matter in executing the study is that you can, when everything is running, you are able to build and maintain full context of your data without, I use this example a lot when we sort of onboard people. Sometimes you have a Google Sheet you're working on with someone and it has 5 columns and it takes you at least a day to agree what the column titles should be, let alone format of the titles. Take that, multiply by thousands, multiply by X amount of stakeholders, becomes very difficult. There's actually one thing we're very excited about diving into a bit more. I was just curious, so from people, and I think this sponsor perspective here really matters because the sponsor is responsible for the conduct of the trial and they are responsible for generating the evidence. The evidence is in the data. I wonder if you had experiences with problems with issues in the data or the lack of connections or just can't make sense of it and have to hire another CRO to make sense of that data.
We haven't had that issue ourselves, but I mean, I definitely could see how that issue would come about, certainly without somewhat of a unified platform where you're stitching together stuff. It's just more variables, more places where you may or may not get information, whether that's on time or not, seeing quality. And so it's probably a lot more cleaning that has to happen. So we haven't seen it, but I mean, I think your point is valid and I can anticipate that those issues could arise.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting perspective, right? Bringing back to incentives. There's a very interesting article. We might link it later. It shows like 3 different examples of CRO pricing. About 50% of the entire quote is on data management. I think there's a real problem there. I think it's one of those things you mentioned earlier about, especially at digital health. It's hard to know what to do, right? What are the right steps? I can confidently say it happens at large pharma level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole industry that's sort of just built around basically making sense of data and copying data into the submission format, this SDTM format. Like the sort of standard practice there to make sure that things are done properly is called double programming, where you sort of take 2 people, you put them in separate rooms and you give them the same task, then you compare the results at the end to make sure that it's been copied in the correct format. And I think this goes back to sort of quality and theater of quality, because that feels to me like theater of quality in that it sure, it can catch some problems, it feels better than having one engineer or one person going through and doing it, but it still is inherently flawed, as opposed to having a system that actually just knows what data to expect in the first place and knows how the data should be transformed. So, giving it to 2 people to do separately and then comparing the results, yes, I guess that's better than giving it to one person, but it feels like theater to me. First of all, it's twice as expensive, but it doesn't actually address the root problem, which is that there's a person who's looking through spreadsheets in the first place. Like, why not just have the system understand the data? I mean, we understand the reason why is this fragmentation, but there's no theoretical reason you can't just have it all on one platform.
Which brings me to one of the conclusions that we're thinking quite a lot about is, what kind of means and processes and culture do you have to be able to identify that data structures and how you move them around the system is actually impacting and creating a problem? Yes or no? And moving that along the chain as well. If change management is such a problem, are you able to identify that? Do you have incentives to like spot it? And do you have a culture, you have systems in place to like change that? That to me personally is where that idea of being tech-driven comes in. Because when we say tech-driven, we're talking about people who historically, advancement of technology was about having means and having resources and having time to look at a problem and come up with a new solution. I think clinical trial space is like starved for this right now, because of the regulations, because of the safety risks, because of incentives. Emil, what's your perspective on that, on the conclusion?
I agree. I think there is a lot of, just this chat alone has been very exciting. I think just, every time I sort of sit down and start talking about the opportunities and the ideas involved with the unified tech platform, I get excited about it. But I think you're right that this, there isn't really the incentive to do it. A unified tech platform means that trials can be more efficient, which means that you can charge less for them. So I think that sort of is the root of the problem. But I think, being nimble and being tech forward means not accepting the status quo. And I'm personally really, really excited about the progress we're making on a unified platform like this and the promise it has to really make things more efficient and just much, much better.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, I echo everything you guys have said. I think it creates a better user experience, and I think ultimately, if it is able to increase both, speed or nimbleness or kind of how you want to describe or efficiency, as well as quality, that's a pretty powerful combination. So I think it's certainly a good pursuit to have, and keep it up. Yeah.
And I'll put that in our product strategy: speed, efficiency, quality.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. It's been a good chat. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.